Welcome to Learn with Us. My name is Troy Sawyer. I'm the lead developer for Western Information Management. This is the third part of our classification series. First two parts were Classification 101 and Classification for Small Business. And in this session, we'll actually be classifying it. We'll take an in-depth look at a number of different strategies you can use to put pen to paper when applying classification within your organization. For an overview of today's presentation, we're going to be looking at two classifications from previous sessions. In the first session, the Classification 101 with Daryl Schrader, there was great outlines on the terminology and everything to do with our classification systems. And we'll build off an example he used in his with the trees in our yard and how we can apply classification. Further to that, we'll build off of Peggy Sigelberget and her small organization classification session last time. Within her session, she focused on, she had a great example of a Tasty Buns Bakery classification. We'll actually use that classification later on as we work through the process of applying classification. So how we'll be applying these classifications, the essential focus of this will be to actually classify it, as it's called. And we'll do that in a number of different ways here. We'll actually look at some manual and physical ways that we can apply classification. We'll look at some centralized databases, what we can do to use things like spreadsheets to keep track of these classifications. We'll look at some application solutions. This will be the main focus of today's presentation. In the application solutions section, we'll actually focus on applying classification in a passive way. We'll see more of this later. Then we'll look at some M365 and some SharePoint, how we can apply our classifications into those environments as well. Just a note, classification does not necessarily mean retention. Our classification systems will often have a retention associated with it. A certain classification might imply that you have a certain retention, but for the focus today, we'll actually just be applying classification, not doing retention. The classification often will imply some processes. In the terms of retention, that might mean some archival processes, a disposition, but for the focus of today, we're actually just applying classification. At the end, we'll take a look at some best practices, what we can do within these systems to help user acceptance, have a great classification system within our organization, but at the same time, allowing users to use those same systems efficiently. So let's take a simple example here of a tree classification system. This is a standard family of trees. It's a type of classification. In this case, we can see here down the left-hand side, we have the different families. And if we wanted to go out to our yard and classify the trees in our yard, we might start with this classification. Just a quick note, this classification, this family tree classification is a simple example of a flat classification. And we can also note here that for each one, like the Acer AC has an example or description of the maple trees just to further develop the system to give us some more information on what an Acer AC is. So if I actually wanted to apply classification to the trees in my yard, I might just look out my window and point out to each one saying which one is which. So our Acer AC tree here might be in our front yard, but let's actually further to this, how can we keep track of it? So in this case, our process is just a silly example of how we can actually classify it. In this case, is we're going to walk around and we're going to stick post-it notes to each one. You can see here each tree has got its classification now. We've applied classification essentially here. Again, maybe not very useful. Every time we want to reference this classification or get this information, we'd have to walk around each tree to check out our post-it notes and what we've actually applied. So let's build onto this and move on to the next slide and see how we can use something a little bit more advanced to keep track of these classifications that we've applied. So for this, let's look at a simple example of a database. In this case, we're just going to use a typical Excel spreadsheet, which is a rudimentary example of a database system. So as we went out and applied our classifications with the post-it notes, and we realized that every time we wanted to reference that, we'd physically have to go visit each one of those trees to find that information again. We're going to pull that into a central database so I can stay inside and find out the classification for each of the trees in my yard. So here on the left, you can see that there's a family tree. The tree, just by name, we just named them 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and we applied the family classification. Here you can kind of note, just to extend on this idea of a classification, the classification we might also need some other information. We talked about the idea of metadata and properties associated with that. So as we give something a classification, there might be additional pieces of information we want to keep track of, and this is just to highlight it here in each of these columns in a spreadsheet. We might want to keep track of not just the classification, but where the tree is, the location here, is it my front yard, my backyard, how tall the tree is, and the silly example in the Darrell's where we've actually counted the number of leaves on the tree. Again, this is just a spreadsheet and a reference place where we can go and access the classification that we've applied to our trees. So let's look as we build on this, instead of trees being what we're going to classify, let's actually look at some information, records, different kinds of assets that we might be applying classification to within our organization. So let's move on to another example. We're actually going to take the example of the Tasty Buns Bakery from Peggy's presentation last time. So here we can see we've got an example of a hierarchical classification system where we've got levels within this system that further classify down to an actual classification type that we'll be applying to the documents within our system. So under financial management, the 100, we've got accounts payable. We've got things like checks, invoices, receipts. So as an organization, this is going to be the classification we applied. But within our organization, this isn't how we've organized the actual information, records, or assets that we have. So let's take a look at a typical example of a shared drive that I put together here that is a sample of what we might see for Tasty Buns. So within their organization here, on the right-hand side, they've got things like advertisements and catering events and equipment that they own and meetings. But there's a very big disconnect between this user-driven, project-driven, catering event-driven shared drive and the actual hierarchical structure that we've gotten from our classification. Often it doesn't make sense for us to try to move these documents around to mirror our classifications to our folder structures. So we've got to find a way to be able to apply classification to these documents in a logical way. So let's just take a quick look here. We've got a number of different documents in the folder we're looking at here. But essentially what we want is we want to take this invoice document and we want to match it up to the invoice classification. Just like we got a check here, we want to line up that check to the check classification. We can see here that our catering event has a number of different types of documents, and it makes sense as an organization for us to have that information together. But our classification would want us to split these two documents apart into different areas. So what can we do? Let's take a look at a reorganization kind of idea. So let's take that same shared drive, and if we were to build a classification structure or a folder structure based on our classification, this might be what we see. It might not make sense as an organization for us to go from that left-hand side shared drive to the right-hand side reorganization. Just as an example, if we go back to our trees in our first couple of slides, just because I have 2 maple trees, it doesn't make sense for me to move them to the same part of my yard. So what can we do with these documents here without having to move them or reorganize them, but at the same time, make sure that we're applying our corporate classifications? And this is where we'll move into some actual application, software applications that we'll be able to do. And this will be our main focus. We'll actually passively continue to run our shared drive as we see it on the left, but not have to reorganize to our classification system, but at the same time gaining the benefits of applying our classification. Okay, so let's hop out of our slides for a second here and actually take a look at this shared drive. So what I have open here is I've mapped our F drive here to be our Tasty Buns shared drive. And here we can see under our catering events, this is where we saw on our slide, we've got a number of different types of documents. So what can we do to take this shared drive and get it classified? Get to the classify it part. So we'll take a look at, this is Western Information Management application called Whisper. And essentially, we won't do a tutorial on the actual application, but let's just take a look at how I've set this up for me to be able to work with that shared drive, work with our classification, and have both exist. So what we're basically looking here on the left-hand side is a live view of our shared drive. So this is essentially just looking at our F drive. And we can see here we've got those catering events that we've been looking at. So how can we go from this structure to our classification system? So instead of keeping our relationships between folders and files within the shared drive, I'm going to actually rebuild our classification within Whisper. So this is just a mirror view, and what we're going to do is we're actually going to go from our shared drive view to our classification view. Again, we won't go through how all this is set up or configured, but essentially what we want to see here is our left-hand side is we've got our shared drive. Let's not move documents around, but we want to get these classifications on it. So here on this middle pane, essentially what I'm looking at is I've rebuilt our classification structure in a way that's basically a primary, a secondary, and a tertiary, just like Peggy's classification. So what we want to do is essentially get these documents into our classification. And we're going to do it in this hierarchical view. So I'm going to take that invoice that we talked about when we tried to match the invoice to the classification. I'm just going to drag and drop it on here. So now we have our invoice from that catering event has now been classified into our classification system as an invoice, 112 invoice. Right? We can do that for other events as well. Here, let's go back to the Western IM event that happened. And we're going to take our check here and we're going to take it and we're going to apply it into our classification. A little bit of a manual process here. We can build rules within the application to apply these classifications automatically. But I just wanted to demonstrate how we can take our shared drive, take our classification system, and use an application to apply to classify it. So now we can see that everything that's under 112, let's take this invoice as well. So we had invoice 24, invoice 67. This actually exists in the catering event for Western IM, but this other invoice actually existed under the Halloween Bash event. Going back to our shared drive, we haven't moved anything on our shared drive. This is the passive nature of what we've done. Is we want the users to continue to use their shared drive, grouping documents based off of catering events, while as the records and information management side of us wants to be able to view all of our invoices together. And this is where we can use a number of different applications to do this, where you can create views to see different types of documents in different ways. This is just Whisper application allows us to do it in a passive nature, where nothing actually has to move within the source system. And we can take things like SharePoint or shared drives and get a different view based off of our requirements dealing with our classification. Again, we won't elaborate on retention, but in this case, we might have a retention applied to the invoice classification. All of our invoices should get a particular retention period, and that might be based off of, again, basing it off of our classification. But retention will be in a future session. All we want here is we've now classified our shared drive. It's been classified. Okay, and for the next area here, as promised, we'll take a quick look at how we can do some classification within a SharePoint environment within an M365. So I'm going to pull up a test site here that I've set up for Tasty Buns Financial Management. Again, just to reiterate, we're not applying retentions here. We'll take a brief look at retention labels, but what we want to do is have our documents being classified and viewed within a SharePoint environment. So what I've done here, instead of rebuilding our classification hierarchy in a folder structure, we're going to leverage SharePoint and its configurations to get our documents classified based off of where we're filing them within the system. So basically what I've done is I've taken the Tasty Bun Financial Management, the 100 series, and built a site specific for those documents. This is where we're going to be coming in, and we're going to be filing our financial documents. I've created 3 document libraries here on the left-hand side. This is basically coming down that classification hierarchy. You know, we have one for our accounts payable, one's for accounts receivable, one's for budgeting. So this is the second layer of our hierarchy. Not folders, we're going site for 100 series documents, document library for the secondary classification, and then by nature of me filing documents into this team site, they're getting essentially that classification. Where we will apply specific classification will actually be at the content type here. We want to classify a document. When we drag and drop an invoice here, we have different content types for each of those bottom level classifications. Invoice, receipt, check. Each of those have gotten a content type. And what we're going to do here is we're not going to leverage filing these into different folders. We're just going to use the group by view within SharePoint. So this is a typical way of how we might set up a SharePoint site and give documents that are being brought in a classification. So let's actually bring in a new document here. So I've got some invoices, some scans, all within the 110 document library. So let's just bring up our shared drive. Let's bring this up here. Okay, and we'll take a document from here. So we have a couple of these already filed. We have 24 and 311 already filed. So let me just find 87 here. So we're going to take invoice 87 here. And this is where we are actually moving documents. This is a reorganization exercise to go from one system to another. And in doing so, we're leveraging the SharePoint. So here I've brought it into accounts payable. It's been given the default document type of document. So let's actually classify this as an invoice. So we're going to select the document, change the document type to invoice, and we can see it reorganizes down into our content type groupings. This is nature of getting objects classified within a SharePoint system. Usually like to leverage content types and the metadata columns within SharePoint. As promised, we'll take a quick look at the retention labels. Often our content types will have specific retentions associated with them, retention labels associated with them. And here we can see that I've already configured this document library for any document being filed to this particular area to inherit the retention label of 110 accounts payable. Essentially what I've done here is that we apply the retention label at the secondary level, so everything within this site gets the same retention label. That aside, let's go back here to just recap the SharePoint. We've configured, this can be set up a number of different ways. This is just how I've chosen to set this one up, where this particular SharePoint site is the 100 series documents, and I've further broken them down into document libraries, and then the content type is the actual classification of the document. In conclusion, let's just take a look at a couple of quick points here to take away from today's presentation that might help. First one here is you got to know what you have. It wasn't really enforced here, but if we don't know what trees we have in our front yard, it's going to be hard to put in a classification system that's going to be useful. So inventories are always a good place to start. And users will know what an invoice is, but rarely you're going to have them knowing what 100-110-112 means. Just like everybody knows what a maple tree is, but very people know what Ace or AC is. Applying classification doesn't have to mean reorganization. Depending on the systems you're using, ideally, in a lot of cases, reorganization isn't the answer. Classification might not be the best structure, but we might want to see it that way. We saw what we did with Whisper, the passive nature of being able to view content in different ways based off of the classification will be useful, but our project-based or catering events organization structure made more sense for day-to-day use. Last, classification development should be an ongoing process. Review, adjust, implement. And this also goes for not just the classification items within your classification, but the entire system. How you implement it, training, processes, how people file. We didn't see it today, but often we can set up processes by nature of where you file to or how you put content away. We'll give you the classification like we did in our SharePoint system. Thank you for watching today's Learn With Us session, Classify It. Again, my name is Troy Sawyer. If you have any further questions, feel free to reach out to me on the information provided on the screen.